Okay, so you know you're here because you want to cut through the noise, right? Get to the heart of what's really going on without having to wade through a million articles and opinions.
That's what we're all about.
And today, we're going deep on something that's been generating a lot of buzz, to say the least. The sheer number of lawsuits involving Donald Trump.
And we're basing this deep dive on a recent discussion from the Ring of Fire YouTube channel. They had some really interesting points about the volume and the nature of these legal actions, especially when it comes to author Michael Wolff.
Now, just a quick heads up for anyone who's not familiar with the Ring of Fire, they definitely lean into political and social commentary, so it's important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
But our goal here isn't to echo their opinions or take sides ourselves. We're here to unpack the claims they made about these lawsuits. How many are we talking about? What kind of lawsuits are they? And what could this all mean?
Exactly. We're dissecting the information, giving you some extra context when we can, so you can draw your own conclusions.
Think of us as your guides through this very specific conversation.
So right off the bat, the Ring of Fire folks drop a pretty big claim about the number of lawsuits we're dealing with.
Yeah, it kind of makes you go, hold on a second. They said that Trump's been involved in something like almost 4,000 lawsuits over his career.
And that number, according to one of the speakers, that covers like 30 years.
Wow.
And they didn't just leave it at that either. They gave a pretty concrete example, more than 1,600 lawsuits just related to his casino businesses.
1,600, just casinos.
Right.
And I think they were saying most of those were against creditors.
I mean, that's a lot. It really tells you something, right? About how he's operated, how he's dealt with legal issues throughout his career, not just in politics.
It definitely raises questions, right? Does this point to a certain way of doing business? Or is it just what happens when you're running these huge, complicated operations for decades?
Right. Does all of this legal history maybe inform how he's handling things now?
Yeah. Like, for example, the whole situation with Michael Wolff. Right. For those who need a refresher, Wolff is the author who's written a couple of, let's say, less than flattering books about Trump.
And now Trump is suing them, or at least threatening to sue him, over what Wolff says in his upcoming fourth book.
Which, of course, brings us to the whole question of defamation.
Right. And we all know that when it comes to public figures, the rules of defamation get a little more complex.
Yeah, you can't just say, oh, he said something mean about me, I'm going to court.
Exactly. Remember that big Supreme Court case, New York Times v. Sullivan?
Vaguely.
That set a super high bar for public officials to win defamation lawsuits. They have to prove malice.
Malice. What exactly does that mean in this context?
So basically, it means the person making the statement knew it was false, or they just didn't care if it was true or not.
Like they were reckless.
Exactly. They have to be intentionally trying to harm the person or be completely indifferent to the truth.
So just making a mistake, that's not enough. You have to show they knew they were spreading lies or they were so careless they didn't even bother to check the facts.
That's it. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Ring of Fire folks brought up this idea that maybe, just maybe, this really strict standard is starting to soften a little.
Yeah, and they pointed to some recent settlements in slander and libel cases, not all of them involving Trump, as possible evidence of this.
Right.
So they're suggesting that Trump might be, like, picking up on this potential change in the legal landscape and using it to his advantage.
Yeah, maybe pushing the boundaries a little, seeing what he can get away with.
And if you think about it, that ties back into the huge number of lawsuits we talked about earlier. It's almost like he sees the legal system as a tool, a way to kind of throw his weight around and force people to back down.
That's definitely the impression you get from the video. They paint this picture of Trump as someone who's not afraid to use lawsuits, even if the legal grounds aren't totally solid, just to pressure people into settling.
And they even brought up that whole thing with CBS's 60 Minutes as an example.
Right, like maybe the case wasn't a slam dunk legally, but CBS just didn't want to get dragged through the mud with Trump.
Nobody wants that.
It's expensive, it's time-consuming, and it can be a total PR nightmare.
For sure.
And to really emphasize that point, they mentioned that a former president supposedly considered a multi-billion-dollar settlement with CBS.
Wow.
It kind of shows you the power dynamics at play here, right? That just the threat of a lawsuit from someone like Trump can carry a huge price tag.
Absolutely. So it all comes down to this idea that for Trump, lawsuits, they're just kind of part of how he operates. It's his bread and butter, like they said in the video.
And that's where the whole brander theory comes in.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So the idea is that early on in his career, Trump was very intentional about positioning himself as the brand, the face of his projects, but not necessarily the guy in the weeds on every single detail.
Interesting.
And the theory is that when there were contract disputes, he would argue that his company, the specific entity involved in the deal, they were liable, but he, as the brand, wasn't.
So he was separating himself from the legal and financial risks.
Exactly. And the video suggests he was very proactive about this. He explained it to his lawyers, pushed this brander theory down the line. So it was like a deliberate strategy from the start.
That's pretty savvy, actually. So how does all of this historical context, the aggressive legal tactics and the brander theory, how does that play into their view of the Wolf lawsuit?
They seem to believe that Trump's main goal with Wolf is to force him to back up all the criticism he's been dishing out over the years.
To put up or shut up, basically.
Right. It's like he's saying, okay, you've said all these things about me, now prove it in court.
And they think Trump is confident he can win, maybe by pointing to Wolf's history of making critical statements and using that to build a case for malice.
Yeah, they're suggesting that Trump's looking at the big picture of what Wolf has said over time, not just one or two isolated incidents.
So it's like, if Wolf said something that was later proven wrong, and then he kept saying similar things, Trump could argue that shows a pattern of intentionally trying to hurt his reputation.
Exactly. But what about Wolf's side of things? What are his defenses? I mean, he's got the First Amendment, freedom of speech, all of that.
Right. That's huge. The argument for Wolf would probably focus on the whole reason why we have that high bar for defamation cases involving public figures in the first place. It's to protect the right to criticize those in power.
Absolutely. The idea is that Wolf, as a private citizen, has the right to comment on and criticize the president as long as he's doing it in good faith.
So even if every single detail isn't perfectly accurate, as long as he believes what he's saying is true.
Right. And the First Amendment is there to protect that. The Ring of Fire video even brought up the EU as a contrast, where they said people are getting arrested for criticizing public figures.
Wow. It's kind of scary when you think about it. It makes you realize how important that protection is for open discussion.
Absolutely. So if Trump's team is trying to prove malice, how do they actually do that in court?
Well, they would probably go through all of Wolf's past writings, interviews, statements, everything they can find, looking for inconsistencies, things he exaggerated, things that turned out to be demonstrably false.
Right. And the video specifically mentioned looking for those disproven claims.
Like if Wolf made a claim that was later proven wrong, but then he kept repeating similar claims, Trump could use that to argue that Wolf was intentionally trying to mislead people.
Which brings up a really tricky question.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the line between, like, journalistic interpretation, even if it's critical, and outright lies?
That's a tough one. It's not always black and white.
Right. And then there's this whole idea of the chilling effect, that these kinds of lawsuits could make journalists think twice about reporting on powerful people, even if the criticisms are valid.
Yeah, if you're constantly worried about getting sued, it could make you hesitant to say anything controversial, even if it's important.
But the Ring of Fire folks did offer a counterpoint here. They made a distinction between criticism that's not intended to harm and criticism that is malicious.
Like, they believe their own work falls into that first category. They're critical, sure, but they're not trying to spread lies.
Right. And they emphasized that their commentary is based on their analysis of events and policies, not on a desire to intentionally hurt anyone.
So it really comes down to intent. That's a key factor in defamation law.
Yeah, and the Ring of Fire analysis seemed to suggest that the question of malice is much more relevant in the case of Wolf, given his track record with, let's say, unconventional reporting methods.
Makes sense. So they ended the video with a pretty bold statement, saying that Trump could be the first president in U.S. history to actually win a defamation case.
Yeah, that would be huge. If a former president wins a case like that, it could have a ripple effect on how the media, public figures, and the courts interact with each other.
It's kind of a scary thought. So let's take a step back and look at what we've covered. We talked about the massive number of lawsuits Trump's been involved in, the specifics of the Wolf case, the complexities of defamation law for public figures, and all the different arguments the Ring of Fire folks presented about Trump's motivations and what might happen with this case.
Right, and just to reiterate, we've tried to present all of this information in a neutral way, based on the Ring of Fire discussion. We're not endorsing their viewpoints, just laying it all out for you.
So as you think about all of this, what are the big picture implications of powerful people using lawsuits like this?
What does it mean for the people and media outlets being sued? What does it mean for how we talk about important issues in a democracy?
And maybe an even bigger question to ponder. What does malice really mean in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from all sides? How do we figure out what someone's true intentions are?
Something to think about.